Before we get started with today's episode, I'd like to note that it is about World War II and the early Cold War in Mage the Ascension, and that includes mentions of all the atrocities, both magical and mundane, that period entails. It doesn't get graphic, but I'd like to err on the side of caution. Matthew makes mention to a number of books and movies, and links to those are available in the show notes. In later news, if you're listening to this before December 1st, you can get 20% off any orders through Rusted Icon. That is the licensed World of Darkness, glassware, and decal provider at rusted-icon.net with our code MTP20. That's MTP20. And with that, on with the show.
Silliest Mage game rule ever is that I'm in the middle of a game. They're planning this like high stakes, seriously under planning, this high stakes infiltration of a vampire location in order to get information about the secret of the city. But they decide, simply because they walked into a pub at lunchtime, and I mentioned that there was like burgers and hot wings, that one of them were going to order the spiciest hot wings that were on the menu. And all the mages had to roll stamina. It's one of the few times I've ever had anyone roll stamina in my game.
Yeah, without like a soak roll.
Yeah, I think it was stamina plus etiquette in order to be the person who got furthest into the super atomic fireball hot wings.
So I don't know what this says about us, Matthew, but I have a remarkably similar story.
It says something about our players.
Yeah, of a character needed to generate a distraction. And this was early on, and one character had just gotten Life 2 and Correspondence 2. And he's like, I'm going to shit this other guy's pants. I'm like, but you're currently talking with someone. He's like, can I make a roll? I'm like, I think that's going to be stamina plus subterfuge or stamina plus etiquette. He's like, stamina plus etiquette. I've got like 4 dots in etiquette. So, yeah, we
I would have penalized it by your etiquette level. Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, Mage the Ascension, a game of beliefs, ideas, and deep discussions, now featuring shit and hot wings.
And to think, we weren't first on deck for getting like a 5th edition. Our guest today on Mage the Podcast is good friend of the show, Matthew Webb of Jackalope Live Action Studios. You and I are doing another entry in our series of Mage Across Time and Space, and we are going to discuss World War II, and mostly post-World War II, Mage the Ascension. And before we get started, this is a topic where we are going to need to talk about some of the biggest atrocities in human history. This is kind of the peak of the 20th century period that historians sometimes refer to as the hemoclasm, literally the flood of blood. I say it without hesitation that Mage the Podcast does not endorse fascism, current throwbacks to it, the Nazis, any of the groups that spin off from the Nazis, and as I'm fond of stating, there may be brief moments where I go, Hugo Boss designed a mean uniform, but that is the extent of my approval of German socialism, to put it mildly.
Yeah, to summarize your very even-handed and lovely statement, Nazi pucks can fuck off.
And with that, can you give us a snapshot of what the mortal world was kind of like in World War II? So before we get to talk about what the post-war period was, let's have a brief talk about what the war period was like.
World War II was omnipresent. Like, there's few things in our manifestation of our understanding of the world that is as omnipresent as World War II. There was almost no country which was not involved directly or indirectly in the war, whose economy was not turned towards it, whose fate was in the balance of the contests for power that were happening in the Pacific and in North Africa and Europe and the Middle East. So it cannot be overstated how overwhelmingly dominating for everyone on the planet this event, this conflict was. And at the same time, it is the stage upon which the greatest atrocities in the history of mankind were created. Sadly, this is not solely the doing of the Axis powers. You, of course, have the Holocaust. You have the Japanese atrocities in China and Korea. But you also have, these massive black spots on Western countries like America's Japanese internment of the Japanese. You have the famines in India that were caused by Britain basically choosing to starve Indians to feed the army. And I don't think that we should go into the moral history of these things too much, because we're not scholars on them, and these things would be far better handled by works dedicated to them. I suggest for beginning reading, the Rise and Fall of the Third Reich is an excellent one. Just to start, it goes on from there. But an important thing in the World of Darkness is that it has been explicitly stated by the authors that the atrocities of World War II are always stated to be of mortal working. The supernaturals are not responsible. Hitler was not a secret infernalist or a racist robot. There were supernatural opportunists, but they're never responsible.
And while it does prevent us from doing maybe the conspiratorial history of a game like Fall of Delta Green or Night's Black Agents, I am perfectly fine with that.
Yeah.
And not being able to blame everything on vampires or what have you. So we have this event where 85 million people are killed. Something like 3% of humanity dies in this period of 1939 to 1945, directly tied to the events of World War II. What would you say the biggest changes in the world besides simply the body count are going to be? Like if we look at the world right before the eve of war and right after, if you were to just directly compare those and ignore the war, what kind of differences do we see between the two?
The role that science played in World War II. There was inklings of this in World War I, with the adoption of chemical weapons and tanks and so forth. But the idea that the war is fought in the laboratory was unique to World War II at that time. Also, I think that you had the League of Nations before this, but the idea that war is such an atrocious activity, it must be avoided at all costs, and that a dictatorship one place is a threat to every place, I think is a idea that was founded. But truly, it's hard to chart what the most profound moment was. The Holocaust forever changed our understanding and our approach to how it is acceptable to talk about groups of people. Propaganda became what it was during World War II. Even then, just the existence of the atomic bomb. One man, Harry Truman, could kill more people than any one other person on the planet for 5 years. And no elected official, no dictator has ever had that power, the ability to destroy an entire nation on his order.
Again, this is a mortal undertaking. I imagine the Technocracy was impressed, the traditions were terrified, and the Nefandi were giddy.
The Technocracy was taken completely by surprise by the successes of Trinity. And they, by all indications, even Einstein was a sleeper. As a sleeper, he fundamentally altered the paradigm.
Kind of within Mage, the last moment we get of a Mage altering history is sometime in the 20s with Tsar Vargo's fleet, which is wiped from memory, and with the death of Newton is killed by Euthanatoi gunmen, and pretty well from then on there, the best the Technocracy can do is try and rein in the excesses of technology. It is no longer driving the bus. It is merely trying to keep it on the road.
One exception, and we will be dealing with that gentleman in this podcast, actually.
Let's walk through what happened during World War II on the supernatural side, or at least on the Mage side. What happened within the Technocracy and the traditions during this?
So the most important detail that is touched on in the Virtual Adept Tradition book, and that's where most of our information comes from. Some of it is in the Guides of Technocracy. But the most important detail is that starting in the mid-30s, the Technocracy throws in with the fascists, beginning with Mussolini and continuing into Hitler's Third Reich, and also the 5 elemental dragons, which is the Eastern counterpart of the Technocracy, does throw in with the Empire of Japan. And the reason they do so is on the basis that this is a ordered society. It is based on scientific principles. It presents itself as this hyper-rational futurist thing, which is an odd thing about fascism. Fascism, especially in the 30s, presented itself as being hyper-modern and ultra-utilitarian. while also having some weird traditionalism to it. It's kind of ineffable politically because of this, because of how it combines very, very old things with very, very new things. But the technocracy, especially the New World Order, sees this and decides to throw their backing behind these people who are going to order the world and basically encase the world in concrete, which is the New World Order's ultimate desire.
Yeah, we get this interesting bit in Revised where they note that while the technocracy inner circle went with the fascists, that was not a universal conclusion. Now, mind you, too little too late, and vast atrocities were committed in its name. But what about the traditions? Were they divided, or did they just automatically line up behind the Allied powers?
They were extremely divided. They're now a tradition, but at the time, the virtual adepts were inside the technocracy, and almost immediately they were finding information about what Hitler was doing in Germany and Kristallnacht and in Poland. And they immediately start not only undermining the New World Order's support for them within the technocracy, they were almost immediately a fifth column against involvement of fascists. But they began actively involving themselves in mortal affairs in which to tip the balance against the Nazis. And they claim to have interfered with the communiques from Britain from getting to Roosevelt that would have warned them about Pearl Harbor. So according to Mage, the virtual adepts caused the death toll of Pearl Harbor to be what it was in order to draw the United States, which, if you're not familiar with history, was very reluctant to join the war. It was basically selling war equipment to the Allies, but it didn't want to get involved. And it was not until Pearl Harbor that the tipping point came that they declared war on Japan. And ironically, we did not declare war on Germany. And even though he was not obligated to, Hitler did declare war on us, and is considered to be one of the greatest missteps in history.
So the interesting thing that I find when I go through the history is this appears to be one of the first conflicts in which mages are fundamentally driven by nationalist desires, where the Society of Ether members that were in Germany backed the war machine in a lot of cases. The Hermetics in Germany backed the war machine, especially when we had the Nazi interest in all things occult. We had the supporters of Japanese Shinto, whether they be Akashics or Dream Speakers, going into Manchuria and going into China to take out their enemies. So even the traditions are split. The Verbena still have a black mark for their support of viewing this as a great racial conflict.
The Verbena, to their credit, had delivered the reckoning. There's a quote from World War I by a German scientist, actually. It's either German or British, I'm sure I'll be corrected, that said when, and this reflects on the Sons of Ether, which says that during peace, a scientist's work belongs to the world. During war, it belongs to his country.
And it seems like in some of these cases, it was the mages themselves having their own views perverted. Like when I look at Shintoism, I don't see how that drives a weaponized Japanese state. Do you know how that was brought into the fold as the tool of the emperor?
So it was by emphasizing to the point of perversion the idea of the good death and devotion to the emperor. And I am not a Buddhist. I am not Japanese. This is just from my readings of World War II. But there's a long history in Buddhism and Shintoism that since life is transient, a good death is as important as a good life. And this is reflected in, if you read the Book of the Five Rings and, all the traditional Japanese warrior philosophy. And this was so overemphasized and so perverted by the military rulership of Japan that you got it to the point where Shinto priests were going and actively recruiting young men to be kamikaze pilots and promising them, to be personally blessed by the emperor for doing so, and that it was their duty. It's a chilling thing to look at something which is usually something of peace and bonsai trees and sand gardens, and you see it as this thing being used to recruit suicide troopers.
You make mention of the good death, which immediately makes me think of the Euthanatoi. What was their role, if any?
They actually come out as the good guys, strangely enough. Of all the traditions, the ones that seem to have had the least misunderstanding of the situation, have the best moral clarity, was the Euthanatos. According to the history, they actually interrogated or learned from ghosts coming out of the Third Reich and communicated with each other what was going on inside Germany. And they are the first ones to present evidence of the Holocaust and the various other atrocities to the council. And the council started debating what their reactions should be. And because they're on science, I'm like, the Euthanatos took none of it, walked out of the room, and immediately started their own partisan, like, guerrilla campaign to kill any tradition mage that was involved with the Third Reich. They're one of the few traditions who simply said, no, just no.
Now, speaking of perversions of beliefs, do you feel that there were any other systems of belief that were kind of drawn in and perverted that maybe a traditionalist, capital T, a member of the traditions, would need to fight against, or kind of any reminders that we need to say of, hey, this happened, this doesn't reflect the actual belief?
Nazism drew very heavily upon Northern European paganism and Nordic mythology, to the point where Hitler himself said, if you do not understand Wagner, you cannot understand National Socialism. And he's mostly referring to Wagner's Ring Cycle, which is a retelling of traditional Norse mythology. And these things were grossly perverted by the Nazis. I mean, they were not clean beliefs. They are the beliefs of 13th century raiders who engaged in slavery. That's what the Vikings were. However, they took it to another level, and they took these medieval theological ideas and they turned them with promises of power and prestige into yet another way of turning a person into a weapon. That is one of the ugliest parts of fascism, is it takes a person and it turns what Charlie Chaplin said famously in The Great Dictator, turns it into machine men with machine minds. But the problem is Verbena fell for this. Many Verbena split over this. So before World War II, the Verbena did have a distinct tradition of very traditional druids who still went by old, like, bloodline based belief systems. They subscribed to a system of beliefs which aligned very closely to the German idea of blood and soil, where a nation is made up of the place where you live and your heritage. And if you do not have blood and soil, you are not truly a person, which is part of their argument against the Jews being subhuman, because they're transient people, right? Which is god-awful. Fuck those guys, just to reiterate. But that synced up with a lot of traditional, old school Druid beliefs. And there's a large contingent of the Verbena who said, we can bring back the good old days. The Germans are waving our flags and using our ruins and doing all this stuff. We're going to throw in with them. And, we're going to finally beat the Church of Rome back, and we're going to get the good old days back. There's a lot of Verbena who said no. These people are cowards and murderers. What are you doing? There's no Nazis in Valhalla.
And that seems to take us through the traditions and the technocracy. The last two awakened factions I think of that had like major roles are going to be the Nefandi and the Crafts. What do you think the Nefandi made of World War II?
Well, it's important to emphasize the Nefandi are responsible for none of this.
Yeah.
Right. They are absolutely not responsible for any of this. However, if you pile corpses knee deep, they're going to have fun, right? They're witnessing the ultimate depravity of humanity. They can summon forth that energy, and they can certainly make it worse. In their mind, hasten the end of this world so they can be gods of the next one.
There are fewer pure embodiments of their anointing of creation than a mushroom cloud. And with this much blood and this much magic and this much chaos, their summonings of their dark masters are able to reach levels that they haven't been able to achieve possibly in centuries. And they can cackle about it and say, you all did this. Yeah.
We didn't do it. Like World War II to them could also represent, this is the ultimate argument that we're right, that humanity is inherently flawed. This is a failed experiment. This is what you do to each other without our help. And yet you sit there, you traditions, you technocrats, and argue that these entities, this world is worthy of ascension? This one?
And World War II, as you mentioned before, is totalizing. Even the crafts don't have the opportunity to avoid this. The Taftani and the Alibatin and the Ngoma, who are being drawn into this, the Kopaloe are dealing with the fact that there is the Pacific Theater. And at this point, one of my favorite Onion headlines, Dastardly Japs attack U.S. colonial non-state. America was colonizing Hawaii in a way that was particularly potent at the time. So even they aren't able to avoid it. The Wu Kang use this as an opportunity to do harsh blows against the Wu Lung. It's a group that, to save themselves, they made promises to demons that eventually require some very, very strict lifestyle choices, some curious traditions in terms of magical performance, and they are informed by the shamanic practices that were slowly being crushed by the introduction of legalism into Chinese belief and culture at this point 3 millennia ago. They use this as an opportunity to, quote-unquote, inform the allies of where important arms depots are, and all of them are major Wulong schools. So for the first time in literally millennia, the Wu Kang are ascendant in China. The Akashics are internally divided, and the Wu Kang kind of step out. They use this as a time to try and cut down the Wu Lung. The Technocracy notices this and destroys them both. And by the end of the war, both of them have effectively retreated to Hong Kong, each thinking that the other one is in control of the rest of China, which is a state that persists for the next 55 years or so. So what did the drawing down of World War II look like then on the magical side? So you made mention of the virtual adepts. The Euthanatoi make the atrocities of the war and the German war machine obvious. How does that, on the magic side, how do things wind down?
Well, one thing important to note is the Alibatin are still a member of the traditions at this point. They are not a craft. They do not leave until the late 40s. When the chaos of post-British colonialism makes them retreat to the Middle East to kind of handle their own problems. And that leaves the seat of correspondence empty to be taken by the virtual adepts later. In, I believe, 1961 is the date, early 60s. But even then, the virtual adepts have one foot out. They've realized that maybe they're not backing the right horse. So the virtual adepts, showing the files that they have access to, eventually convince the Technocracy to turn on the Axis and no longer support them. It's worth noting that in the memo in which the New World Order says this, they do not mention the Holocaust. They do not mention the atrocities. They mention the Nazis dabbling in the occult, that they are not sufficiently technocratic. The New World Order did not consider the Holocaust to be a justification, but apparently Himmler's Circle of Knights was. The council finally decides that this needs to be dealt with. And then the Nafandi are running so out of control. There is a meeting of minds, which is not fully specified in any material. It must have been a very interesting sort of bridge of spies sort of encounter in which the Technocracy and the tradition say, listen, we hate you and you hate us, but maybe those guys over trying to end the world should be handled first. So one of the first cross-sect sort of cabals start being formed specifically to hunt the Nafandi in the age at the end of World War II, which reaches its culmination in the sundering of Berlin, which was basically a final apocalypse bomb attempt by the Nafandi to summon their dark masters in this world at the close of the war in Europe in 1944.
Depending on what book you look in, the Alibatin, for instance, left the council as early as 1922 and in other cases as late as 1943. It's one of those things where pick your continuity and run with it. And if you look in some sources, Porthos Vincempress is listed as leading that ritual to ban the Nefandi from Earth, and in other cases, it's different Hermetic masters. So if something we say doesn't quite jive on the magic side, it is not something that the sources we have for the game have been entirely consistent on.
The only other group, like supernatural group, that I've encountered that's had a completely like moral clarity, and this is a weird one because they show up in Mage and they also show up in Hunter of the Reckoning, and these details are offered up in Hunter of the Reckoning. The Arcanum actually moved their collections out of Germany and split and cut off the Thule Society infiltrated chapter houses that they had in order to assist with fighting occult influences in the Third Reich. And they also claim to have been involved. The Arcanum being the mortal sorcerers and scholars who attempt to be set to be outside of supernatural conflicts and are a traditional and a personal favorite little subgroup of mine.
And you talk about these parties that were sent. One of my favorite examples of a brief collaboration is between the Sons of Ether, the Society of Ether, and the Void Engineers to create a network of killer satellites to keep the Star Squids out. And they immediately disavow each other. I don't know about you, but I would be fascinated to run a brief chronicle during that wind down. There had to have been the utopianist faction that says, haha, we can really merge everything together and everyone can win, while everyone's trying to backstab each other and steal technology or mystical or techno-magical things from one another. And this brief period that probably created years of fluorescence as the technocracy is briefly infected with mysticism, much as it was in the late 1800s, and the traditions probably pick up a lot about techno-magic they wouldn't have otherwise.
If you read about the Ethernauts and the Void Engineers, you'll notice it's often mentioned that while the Men in Black and the Hermetics and all that are at each other's throats, that the Ethernauts and the Void Engineers in general with their traditions kind of have more of a gentlemanly sort of respect for one another, and will kind of sometimes just, if no one else is watching, if the New World Order political officer is sleeping, they'll just kind of flash their high beams at each other in passing and just keep going, because they have more of a I'm going to discover things before you do sort of thing going on, not a you must be destroyed. A few of the old captains remember when they were destroying, Nazi flying saucers together.
Now, we've talked about the war, we've talked about the closing of it. I guess the last thing to me is there is the Wewelsburg tribunal that is done between the traditions and the technocracy that sentences 34 individuals to crimes against ascension, which to me is one of the greatest thing. A Quasitor, a member of the Golden Chalice from the Euthanatoi, or any number of other I'ma kill you or legal groups can shout in the world of darkness. That's just me. And I guess the other note to note for people who are interested in things across lines, the dropping of the 2 nuclear devices on Japan do seem to possibly awaken Garul, one of the Neverborns, one of the entities that sleeps at the entrance to Oblivion, who will theoretically wake at the end of days or something like that. And in the continuity laid down, I think by Richard Dansky in the Book of Mirrors, it is suggested that when Garul woke up, the Nefandi lost power because the Nefandi are being powered not by the Neverborn, but by their dreams. This is never mentioned again, to the best of my knowledge, and is one of those little drop-in lines where you're like, wait, what? But Richard Dansky probably wrote it, so I'm entirely cool with it.
So one of the things to note about the atomic bomb is that when that is detonated, it is, in werewolf terms, it is literally called the fire of the worm. It is normal mortals managing to directly manifest the worm of destruction. And in fact, according to it, the dragon lines, which are the mystical energy lines of the East in the world of darkness, what we would call ley lines, are permanently tainted with worm energy by the dropping of the nuclear weapons. And we're talking about the fiery death and murder of over 80,000 civilians in atomic fire. It's not simply that we dropped a device. We leveled 2 cities that burned for days afterwards. It was terrible.
Indeed. And
Yeah.
in addition to the human casualties of this, the total amount of energy transfer that occurred, of solid turning directly into energy, is less than the weight of a US dollar bill. Fewer than 1 gram of material was converted, and that was enough to, as Matthew said, kill nearly 100,000 people and set fire to whole cities. In Wraith continuity, whenever a historical object is destroyed, it appears in the underworld in many cases. And 2 relic nuclear devices appear in the underworld.
One thing I can recommend to anyone who's in World of Darkness is you go out and you buy of Charnel Houses of Europe, which is the World of Darkness supplement about the Holocaust, specifically in Wraith the Oblivion, where the hierarchy literally looks at the Holocaust and at the sites, the death camps and so forth, and says, even as the wardens of the dead, we do not have a framework for dealing with this level of criminality. So they decide that the various sites of the Holocaust in the Shadowlands are the domains of the victims, and the perpetrators of those crimes are consigned there to whatever justice their victims see fit, which is perhaps the most chilling and appropriate fate, but is also part of the reasons I recommend Charnel Houses of Europe. It is perhaps one of the most sadly beautiful role-playing game books ever written. It is the gold standard for how to handle a difficult subject.
The opening dedication is, this book is dedicated to the survivors of the Holocaust who have spent 50 years telling their stories. What you hold in your hand is a tribute to their perseverance and, in some small way, an attempt to carry on their legacy for the sake of the generations who will never know them. Toba Rabba.
Yep.
I have no idea how to pronounce that, and apologies if I got that wrong. I do in no way speak Hebrew. But yeah, that we get the idea of the Dark Kingdom of the Wire, the Covenant of the Millions.
I will make a small media recommendation right here. You will have a tough time finding this film. It is called Come and See. It was made in the Soviet Union in the 80s from Stalingrad. He actually survived as a child through the siege of Stalingrad. And it is about the anti-insurgent operations of the Nazis and their local cohorts. It is called Come and See because it is the line from Revelations where then the angel said, "Come and see," and I saw, right, is where it came from. It is about what the Nazis did in Eastern Europe, not the Holocaust specifically, but what the Nazis were capable of in Eastern Europe, and just the sheer savagery. It's set in Belarus. And the most curious thing about it is that it is filmed not like a war film. It is filmed like a horror film, where it constantly just shows you just enough. It is like Schindler's List in the fact that it is a wonderful film that I think everyone should watch, and you'll never want to watch again, but you should watch it once. It is raw. And that rawness is the only thing which does Nazism justice.
So we have talked about the war, and I'll say it's very immediate aftermath. Is there anything that you think we should know about on the Mortal or the Mage side before we start talking about what I will properly call the post-war period?
So there's a lot of stuff which is coming out of World War II, which is like kind of like manifest knowledge from World War II. That immediately towards the close of the war, you start seeing kind of filter out into society. The level of change in like gender and racial roles, especially in America, cannot be overstated. The Rosie the Riveter, you have black frontline troops for the first time. You have the Black Panthers are actually one of Patton's Army tank units. And they had some of the best records in World War II. But not only that, you have like a great deal of like scientific knowledge and things are changing. You have, in World War II, they've broken the Enigma, and you have the first general purpose electronic computer. We've penetrated the atmosphere for the first time. We've taken the first pictures of outer space with V-2 rockets. We, of course, have the atomic bomb. And I think it's hard for us to appreciate how much we did not understand how destructive that weapon was as lay people until basically the scientists screamed in our ears and in fact attempted at several points to take control of the weapon themselves rather than let it sit in the hands of the politicians, because we thought it was just a really big bomb. And then if you are interested in a podcast about that specific topic, I highly recommend Hardcore History series, The Destroyer of Worlds, which is actually about the aftermath of the development of atomic weapons and its effect on American society.
Additionally, coming out of that, we just have this, at least when I think of post-war things, is the idea that the state can organize all activities of the country at the same time that people are trying to tell women they're not men's equals anymore, even though they were during the war, and likewise blacks were the equals of their white compatriots, and they are being told no, no more. At the same time, the hands of the state realized, in a way that only had been previously learned at the hands seemingly of Bismarck, is the power of an organized state and kind of the seductiveness of the government being able to control an economy, which would ultimately not turn out well in several cases.
Well, that's why fascism has its name. The fasces are the bound together sticks that represented the contiguance of the Roman state. Mm-hmm. That is where the fasces came from. And that was the idea of the fascism, and to an extent Leninism as well, is that you could operate a society like a machine at the head of a wise ruler. Turns out that's a recipe for brutality, to say the least.
Yes, in Cincinnatus, we haven't had a lot of good examples of that. And I find it interesting that in the U.S., we called it the fasces of state, the ceremonial mace that is raised and lowered at the beginning of each congressional session. Now we just call it the mace. The word fasces has kind of been frowned on. So we get this technological explosion out of the war. We get this attempt to return to normal, I'll say in quotes, or more accurately revert to the racial and sexual power structure of before the war, which is very quickly subverted.
And just to be clear, sure, the racial structure of the army wasn't that great either. Blacks were frequently used as second line. They were under-equipped. When they faced the Axis in Europe, they were often not as heavily supported. For example, when the 101st Airborne was famously fighting in the Battle of the Bulge and holding out for Patton to rescue them, though they contend that description, they were there with two other black units who were routinely denied supplies in favor of the 101st Airborne. The idea that in any way they conceded that they were equals, it was more, women, you need to do this because the men aren't here. Yeah. We have to use the substandard equipment. It was the women and the African American troops in them who brought forth the experience and the evidence that they can do as much. No one ever embraced that as something they were going to advocate.
Once you have nuclear devices, suddenly game theory becomes a thing that exists. We have the ability to land a device capable of rendering several hundred meters in every direction, barren of all possible life.
Literally vaporize things so much to the point that it burns a shadow into the wall. The Hiroshima lovers, look it up. Well, also, game theory is very interesting. It ends up being one of the most influential pieces of mathematics, and its first application is actually to flak. Or one of its most practical first applications is to flak patterns for anti-air. And what they find out, and the Germans are one of the first ones to use this, and this is before the Theory of Games and Economic Behavior is published by von Neumann and Morgenstern in 1944. And is perhaps one of the most important mathematical works, but it's still a mathematical book that's 800 pages from World War II. So if you read it, it's a good cure for insomnia. But they start applying game theory to flak formations. And what it is they realize that it is the natural inclination of a bomber pilot to avoid heavy flak areas, when in reality, the most risk is to remain inside the sights of the guns enough for them to tune in the aim at you. So what they recommend is they stop doing evasive action. They say go as fast as you can towards the target and hit it, because every second you're there puts you more at risk. And the Germans get very, very clever about this, where they use old flak guns to create this illusion of this giant mass of anti-aircraft fire, and then they hold off using the newer, more accurate guns. So as the Allied pilots divert and try to avoid this horrible nightmare of relatively harmless exploding shells, they tune in and quietly aim and shoot one down at a time.
And at the same time, it's one of those things where all of that maneuvering made it harder for the bombardier to properly dial in the target. So it is one of those cases where, yes, your individual run may be more dangerous, but this removes the need of us doing a second, third, fourth run to make sure that that ball bearing plant is taken out. And once we know that the enemy has this certain amount of material, we enter true game theory, which is, what is the best strategy when someone else is trying to take your best strategy into consideration?
Then game theory is famously applied later in the world to the theory of mutually assured destruction. Another thing which comes out of a very similar thing, where you basically have what is called human factor ergonomics. Ergonomics means, we think of it as chairs, right? That's where we get ergonomics from. But in reality, it's the study of life, like how the ways of life operate, human ways operate. And an ergonomic chair is a chair which is designed for how humans actually do things. And you start having what's called human factor analysis starts, and it's really a United States thing, where they take and they start applying scientific research and approaches to human behavior. If you ever watch surgery and you have the doctor go scalpel, and he holds his hand out and the nurse says scalpel and gives it to him, that is a procedure that was developed by human factor analysis. There was this very strong idea of you can create methodologies for doing things effectively and hyper efficiently by studying how humans operate.
Yeah, this is an idea that is introduced originally by Frederick Winslow Taylor, who tries to break every task down to its simplest human doable thing and invents the idea of the time motion study. And when I think of time motion studies, I think of the time motion managers, literally a methodology within the iterators. So this is the first time where we get the science of treating the human machine to become as efficient as humanly possible. It creates the atrocities that allow mass mechanization to create weapons of destruction that tear through human flesh. But at least partially on the upside, this is also an era in which modern surgery is invented, where literally we record the number of inches that the scalpel needs to travel, and we come up with the shortest possible path to minimize the rate of infection. So the progenitors and the Kosians are also making leaps and bounds at this time, as these methods of engineering are being applied to the human body for one of the first times.
And human mind and human communication and the New World Order is soaking this up. They have this dream in the iteration X. They have this dream of a mechanized mind.
Were there any big psychological movements outside this person as machine thought structure that come out of World War II that we see in White Wolf games?
Well, it's actually funny because there's one guy who kind of really hits his stride. He's been around since World War I, actually. He's hanging out in Switzerland during most of the war. And it's Carl Jung, and he was a protege of Freud, and then he kind of goes out on his own, and he starts developing Jungian analysis. If you've ever heard about the ego, the superego, the shadow, animus and anima, that is all Jung. His primary thesis is that human beings have problems because their subconscious and their conscious are imbalanced. There are ways that you deal with who you are, which are healthy and unhealthy. They have the idea of archetypes for different types of behaviors that you engage in and that you have internally. You'll notice as I am going through those words, I have hit at least 5 things which show up in actual White Wolf rules. Mm-hmm. shadow, animus, archetype, all that kind of stuff. So Jung is not only a huge influence on post-war thought, but the entire idea of a global subconscious. He kind of goes quasi-mystical about 1947. He produces a very interesting book called Psychology and Alchemy, where he draws, like, his big thing is that we've always had certain desires, and we just express them in mystical ways, various ways. You see a similar thing in the hero's journey and the hero of a thousand faces later. But he constantly has this idea, and he says alchemy is about improving the self and achieving gold, and psychology is basically modern alchemy. And he produces this book. He also does archetypes in the collective unconscious. He starts publishing this like 9-volume set in 1935, and that continues into the 50s. And his stuff becomes hot. He has a profound effect, not just on human culture, but on how we think about the idea of a subconscious or a subconscious urge.
And I think the best Mage reference on that is probably Book of the Fallen, which is one of the most thoroughly Jungian texts that we get within the game. I was surprised he wasn't listed as one of the authors in it. What would you say the other key, I guess, trends in post-war thought are going to be?
The rise of Eastern mysticism in the West is a big one. Martial arts was taught by Japanese Americans, but mainly to other Japanese Americans before the 1940s. But as American servicemen start returning to America, this is where karate and like meditation and stuff start showing up again. You have American servicemen who are stationed in Okinawa and Tokyo, and they learn these things. And some of them gained a respect for it because they had to fight hand to hand with people who are trained in it. You see the first karate lessons are being held in the continental United States. There were karate dojos in the Japanese communities in Hawaii, to a certain extent in California, but less so, by a man named Robert Treyas, who is a former U.S., I believe he was in the Army or the Marines, I can't remember which, and he teaches the first karate lessons. He's considered to be the first American black belt recipient. And you start seeing the first, like, true respect for Eastern martial arts as both a self-defense and as a mystical practice is really arising out of that. You also see, after the 1940s, the end of the concept of empire. The idea that the nation which can conquer shall conquer. The lionization of national sovereignty. So you start seeing the dismantling of the British Empire, which certainly was not the end of the struggle there. Their fallout from that continues to this day, but the sun began to set on the British Empire once again after that moment.
And seemingly in the same way that nationalist powers wound up splitting a lot of the traditions and the conventions against themselves, I could see in that slow fall of empire that as nation states are being fashioned out of whole cloth, where previously maybe that idea didn't exist, suddenly the crafts are being divided, where there is a division within the Mud Zimbabwe or something in a way that we didn't have since the Ghost War, or maybe the nationalist lines in the Caribbean, the Bata'a, were previously kind of united in their hatred of colonial oppressors, and now as that goes and goes into a whole bunch of different nations, some being held still by the United States, others going to the Dutch, others going to the British, and then becoming nation states of their own, the power of nationalism is fighting against attempts to maintain contiguous cultures. And I imagine we'll see this again if we ever do an episode on the fall of the Soviet Union. And so when I think of inspirations for a Mage game, one of the key things I look at is philosophy. Another key thing I look at are going to be what happened in the arts. And we didn't quite have a full-blown postmodernism yet. So what filled in that void? What do you think, for a Mage game at least, the important post-World War II arts are?
Perhaps not at the time. It was not considered as important as it was. But the one artistic movement and storytelling style from that era, which has shown to be the most persistent, is noir, film noir. You can trace it all the way back to the late 20s and Dashiell Cavett and all that. When Fritz Lang, who is a German filmmaker, shows up in Hollywood. He starts making films and he starts influencing things. You start seeing the cohesion of the noir style. And the noir style of film, classic noir period, is considered to start really in earnest in 1940 with a film called The Stranger on the Third Floor. And it kind of ends as the last great classic noir film is The Asphalt Jungle. And that is where you get The Maltese Falcon and The Third Man and all these great films. And in fact, if you go on the Internet Archive, there's a lot of kind of like secondhand noir films from that era that I highly recommend. There's actually one that stars Orson Welles, where he is a former German spy who during the war was infiltrating American culture, and the war ended and he is infiltrating American politics, and there's a Nazi hunter trying to find him, even though he's managed to get engaged to the daughter of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And it's actually a very chilling portrayal of a fascist by Orson Welles. Yeah, it's The Stranger, 1946. It's literally about Orson Welles playing a Nazi infiltrator who's trying to subvert the government in order to rebirth German nationalism.
Why do you think that noir has so thoroughly captured our imagination? It seems like it draws back to pulp, but subverts it in a certain way generally. In pulp, the good guy wins, they get the dame, and what have you. And noir is generally not that way. Why do you think that it is proven to be so enduring?
I think it's because their heroes are achievable. I think that if you look at Sam Spade and the heroes of a noir film, that's what gave us anti-heroes. An anti-hero in a noir film is someone who kind of makes their own sense out of reality, decide on their own code. And noir is ultimately dealing with what was once called the death of God. That if you take the revelations of nihilism, of Nietzschean philosophy, you can go two ways. You can either go to crazy Hitler town with it and decide, all is power, or you can take the noir approach and you can say, yes, there is no inherent morality to the world, therefore it is our duty to decide upon it earnestly and honestly what feels like it is good, not cynically like a fascist does. I think it provides a model for the world which includes both its light and its darkness in a way that is very compelling. And I think that it is noticeable that noir just seems inescapable. It had echoes in the romantic movements of the 19th century, but the moment it seems to have been uttered, it stuck. It shows up in every portrayal of Batman that's worth its salt. It shows up, it's deeply into the DNA of the world of darkness. In fact, the current offerings, the 5th edition offerings, are much more noir than Gothic punk.
And holy shit, they were well dressed.
Well, yeah, also fedoras and three-piece suits. You can't go wrong with those, no matter what your gender presentation.
Yeah.
I can show you photos. And also, I mean, it is kind of timeless. And frankly, though, I think that it probably would not be as timeless if it was filmed in color.
What drove that sparse style, though? Was that a moral thing, or was that born of something?
Well, I think it was rationing.
Huh.
I mean, there's literally a fashion style which is cited as being the wartime fashion style, which is also called, I believe it's like scholarly name for those people studies is utility style. You see clothing that's meant to last a long time, is extremely functional, and doesn't have any frills, because every bolt of cloth you were allowed to buy one shirt per 6 months, but on your ration card.
This is the era where Christine Dior is kind of in his ascendancy, the death of the shoulder pad in the pocket.
Christine Dior hits, I believe, 1947 is the first real revival of French fashion, which between the war and the fact that, stormtroopers were occupying the streets, kind of put a dent on the Paris fashion show. But that is where you see the end of dresses that have chest pockets on them for women, the end of the apron, and you see what's called the new look. And the new look shows up Christian Dior's is probably the single most influential person in fashion history. And it basically, ladies, if you hate the fact you have no pockets, it's his fault. But like round shoulders, full skirt, cinched waist, everything that we consider to be the classic stylish look from 1950 starts with Christian Dior in 1947, when before it is much more this utility wear.
And in construction, we're coming out of a post-war period where we kind of have two things going on. Europe has been destroyed. No one has the money to bring back Art Deco or Beaux Arts. We have the last wisps of Art Deco, mostly sculptures and furniture, that kind of persist.
It's also Art Deco became very strongly associated with fascism, mainly thanks to Mussolini.
And likewise, we see the death of the Italian Futurist movement, which I just thought was gorgeous, but fascist. so that goes into like the no-no box.
Them and Hugo Boss just got ruined forever.
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, as my friend Jonathan says, why is it either you can have good people or good dressers?
We get a ton of concrete. We get the idea of brutalism, where a material should show what it is. Prefabrication comes up and running.
Well, what happens is that you have all these architectural firms who are used to designing like big, beautiful skyscrapers and all that. And they are turned to and said, and the government says, you don't get any concrete unless we say so. And the thing that we want you to build is bases and bunkers and airstrip. And we have these strict timelines, and if you can't do that, you're shut down until the war's over. So you have all these architectural and construction firms who turn to earlier ideas that were actually put forward in the like 1920s and 30s but never caught on. Prefab concrete, like the very idea that you have pre-poured concrete supports and bricks and entire walls and all stuff, and they can come in and overnight they can build you an aircraft hangar. They take all this institutional knowledge. Just another example of out of the war, we have all this institutional. They learned how to build something overnight, and they learned how you do it is you design everything the same way over and over and over and over again. Everything is reproduced, and you do as little. Like it is more imperative for you to flatten the hill than for us to design a home for that hill. And they come out of that, and you get all this prefab architecture. You get the style that we would commonly associate with slightly older high school buildings, with the metal poles and the sheets, and everything goes into a concrete like cone-shaped thing, and all this stuff. And that eventually that gives birth to the suburbs, because the suburbs are born of standardized housing, and so this idea of standardization and prefabrication of everything comes in. But strangely enough, another guy is really hitting a second renaissance who is completely opposed to this. He's the diametric opposite. He is absolutely opposed to it, and that is Frank Lloyd Wright. Well-known marauder. Yeah. Do you know what the nickname for falling water is amongst people who have to preserve it? Rising mildew. It leaks like a sieve. Frank Lloyd Wright creates his school out in New Mexico for designers. He designed some of his biggest buildings to date, and he says no. He has prefab concrete architecture. He creates what's called the mosaic method, but what he does is he says, I'm going to have individual bricks made just for this house, and I'm going to have people cast bricks to make this wall the way I want it to look. And he advocates that buildings and furniture should all be made bespoke. It should be for where it is. It should complement the landscape. The window pattern matches the way the chair backs are. He was a complete opposite approach to this. And gorgeous. The absolute other end of that institutional design is Frank Lloyd Wright.
Yeah, he also did the Usonian projects to create small houses, and to do a Frank Lloyd Wright house on the budget he was given gives you a small-ass house. But yeah, the Prairie period I thought was particularly gorgeous. I'm going to advocate that he is a marauder geomancer at some point, and I'm going to see if I can get that into Mage canon at some point. But, yeah.
I honestly, I think that he is a excellent example of a non-Tesla coil and sparks son of ether.
Okay.
because he was constantly at odds with the architectural establishment, to the point which, sadly, he was fictionalized and lionized by Ayn Rand in The Fountainhead. That is a stand-in for Lloyd Wright in his fight with the New York Planning Board, which pretty much controlled how New York operated for decades. Just as a note, I think Ayn Rand only makes sense if you apply her mindset to artists, and even then you're pushing it, because The Fountainhead is a novel about the struggles of a innovative architect against an oppressive planning bureaucracy. And her main thesis in that is that an artist has the right to destroy his creation rather than see it be polluted by lesser minds. And that makes a certain amount of sense to me as an artist. But then she turns around and says corporations are also works of art of their CEOs. And I'm like, you've never worked for a corporation, have you, Anne?
It's also one of those cases where if you follow this to its logical conclusion, we get the special edition versions of the original trilogy. So any philosophy that results in that. So we've talked a lot about the high arts and production techniques. And one of the things that if I were to run a game in this era, I would give probably the Technocrats or similar groups a leg up in the production of charms. These are mass-produced magical devices. And if I wanted to represent that, to me, that could be a new technology that is added to the Ascension War. We are no longer going to craft this hand-wrought Spirit Bane charm. I am going to make 12 at once, and they will be disposable and reflect America's wealth and power globally as soon to be one of two superpowers.
Well, and also, since the War of World War II was fought in the laboratory, this is the first time when prototype becomes code for more advanced. That is when you get the super weapons, the things which have never been seen before. Some of the super weapons are jet fighters, which are, of course, V-2 rockets, assault rifles. You have the vampire scope that Germany deployed, which was a infrared sniper scope. And of course, you also get like lightning guns and weaponized radar, which never really took off. Like that would be another thing, is that the concept of the super weapon is real at that point. And the Nazis were mainly obsessed with it because towards the middle of the war, they realized they were outnumbered 10-1 on the Russian front. If they were outnumbered, they were desperately trying to outgun. And that's why you had tanks the size of Nebraska and all these things like the Mouse, right, in order to kind of solve their problem there.
And as you mentioned that, I think another thing that will come out of this is one of the things you get when you start treating the human body as the machine is the idea of performance-enhancing drugs. World War II seemingly was half fascism, half amphetamines in terms of advancing the Axis powers. And I could also see the other people coming away from this and being like, what is this thing that allowed this person to stay awake for 72 hours?
Do you know about Panzer chocolate?
No, go on.
It's chocolate that was issued to Panzer crews, and I cannot make this up. It was chocolate that was issued to Panzer crews that was laced with meth.
The access to these stimulants kind of starts to create what will eventually be Cold War paranoia, but we are not there yet. Quite.
If you watch film at the time, they're more interested in secret Nazis.
Yeah.
That is the paranoia of the flavor until like the 49 is that the Nazis are going to be back. They're going to restart the war. There's rumors of secret cults underneath Berlin that are worshiping pagan gods. I can't make that up either.
Which is interesting because I don't know about you, but that smells plot hook. What are some of the other, I don't want to say weird, but what are the other non-standard new novel occult activities, beliefs that start stemming up in this period?
Lots of technocratic stuff, but also stuff that the Technocracy probably would not. You got a huge revival of what I would call alternative geography. Hollow Earth theories come into mind. During the war, the Nazis actually invested thousands of marks in determining whether or not the inverted Earth theory is true, which is a theory that there is a hollow Earth and we're the ones on the inside of it. So they actually went to this island in the North Sea with a telescope trying to spy on the British fleet by aiming it up at the sky and trying to see the Atlantic Ocean. Yeah, no, it was weird. The Baltic island of Rugen is where it happened. Yeah, Dr. Heinz Fischer, he was shot for wasting so much money on that. You have Roswell in 1947.
Mm-hmm. And within Mage canon, that was a legit alien type thing. Listen to our episode on aliens and Mage on that.
Kowloon.
Yeah, the Kalawan. We have some sources that say that we've been dealing with them since the 1890s. Other ones that say they were attracted by the detonation of the nuclear devices. We get our first proper flying saucer from the Mount Rainier Kenneth Arnold sightings in, I think, 48. The Murray Island incident, which includes an honest-to-goodness description of a man in black in it. So that is one of the first times that enters a common parlance. What else?
Well, you have UFO cults. They start showing up. The Saturn Society and stuff. Like Dianetics is first published in 1950. L. Ron Hubbard, and which goes on to be a full book, and then found Scientology. And you have this rash of like strange like techno-mysticism starts kicking off in a big way. You have Wicca starts being developed in the 30s and 40s, but by a couple, Gerald and Donna Gardner. Wicca being the British form of paganism, like neo-paganism, which really took off the hippies in America. But they were basically neo-druids, and they popularized what is called the witch cult hypothesis, which is considered to be canon in the Mage universe, which is a majority of the people burned at the stake for Satanism were actually people following old ways that were purged by the church. And the idea of the burning times comes from Wicca. While it's not made completely public until 1954, you start seeing I believe they're the Birchwood Coven is established in the 40s, which is the first modern Wicca coven, and that's really the start of the neo-paganism movement, which in Mage canon, this is an attempt to rework. This is an opportunity for the Verbena to rework the blood and soil, like heavily tainted old school, old time religion, if you will, and reinvigorate it to more of a universal consciousness sort of idea. Once again, reflecting the ideas of Carl Jung. If you want to talk about there's this fucking guy, Aleister Crowley.
Let's do a quick thing on this fucking guy.
Aleister Crowley, who's been making trouble since the late 19th century. So at the beginning of the war, he offers his services to the Naval Intelligence Division in the UK. He's rejected, but he's spending the entire time hanging out with like huge figures in British intelligence. Like Ian Fleming is one of his bros. He was a naval intelligence officer at the time, went on to write the James Bond novels. And he publishes the Book of Thoth and the Thoth Tarot deck in 1944, which is perhaps one of the most influential works in what we would consider to be Western occultism that was published in the 20th century. He's living mainly off the contributions of the California branch of his religion of Thelema. If you ever heard the weird Thelemic, that is Crowley's belief system. He's living off of the California Lodge, and they're sex cult magic parties. There's no other way of telling what they do. Of which two of the principal members are, once again, you cannot make this up, Jack Parsons, the founder of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and L. Ron Hubbard.
Jack Parsons was one of those people that when I started reading about the espionage allegations and the JPL and the involvement with new mysticism, I'm like, well, Jack Parsons can't be that rare of a name. And then finding out that they are all the same person was...
He was a communist in the 30s. And then he decides, communism, bah, I want to hang out with Aleister Crowley and have sex magic. Because that follows. He's an award-winning physicist and engineer. He's helping run the U.S. rocket program. At the same time, he's hanging out with Aleister Crowley and L. Ron Hubbard. This is in the middle of the war. He has an affair with his wife's sister. He leaves his wife for his sister. The sister leaves him for L. Ron Hubbard, who then, both of them together, defraud him of his entire life savings. So he was robbed blind by L. Ron Hubbard. And then, I will say this slowly, so you can process this. While working on the U.S. rocket program, He's also working on a series of rituals invented by Aleister Crowley called the Babylon Working, meant to summon the Thelemic divine feminine goddess Babylon, which includes trying to conceive a child. This in its second stage, mind you. I don't know what the first stage involved, but this is the second stage. It involved trying to conceive a child through sex magic with the Hollywood actress Marjorie Cameron and L. Ron Hubbard. Strangely enough, he was eventually fired from the JPL for his conduct.
But not until after founding the Jet Propulsion Laboratory.
Right. He got fired from the job he helped create because he was too busy having sex magic meant to summon a feminine goddess with L. Ron Hubbard and a Hollywood actress.
These are the kind of things that if you included them in a plot in a game, people would be like, this is so unrealistic.
This guy is obviously a technocrat who is tried to shift traditions and then died. So he wrote most of the early American works on Crowleyan occultism in America. And he had this strange blend of libertarianism, kind of like Heinleinian libertarianism, and Crowleyan occultism. All of his work was published posthumously because despite doing all this other stuff, apparently he thought it was inappropriate for him to publish books on the topic. Posthumously, they were published in the 50s, and they're pretty much responsible for our image of what Hermetic magic looks like in America.
Which is interesting because within Mage continuity, Crowley is listed as an ecstatic. And speaking earlier, you made mention of there is one last great mage that is still active that gives us the gift eventually of the digital web. Who is that?
That is Alan Turing. He is assigned. There's a wonderful, the name of the movie, it's got Crumblebum Hammerbatch in it.
Oh, Imitation Game?
Yeah, Imitation Game is an excellent treatment of it, if definitely dramatized. Alan Turing is a mathematician in the real world, a very talented mathematician who is obsessed with cryptography and with cryptographic machines. And he gets hired at Bletchley Park, which is, the cover story is it's a radio factory. In reality, it's an attempt to break the Enigma machine, which is up until that point, unbreakable German code machine. He ends up building the first general purpose digital computer in order to crack the Enigma code. Because if you tried to crack it by hand, it would take 1 million years to decode one message, and they change the key every 24 hours. So he manages to build the Colossus, which is the first digital computer, and they promptly dismantle it after the war and sell it for parts and never capitalize on it. And in the Mage continuity, Alan Turing is the virtual adept, and he advocates for, they have discovered the digital web by 1950, and he is advocating for the digital age and for giving power to the masses via computers, and the Technocracy wants none of it. They think that technology belongs in their hands and power belongs in their hands, and that if given unhampered expression through digital technology, the masses would threaten the technocratic plan. And he is eventually, in the real world, he is convicted of homosexuality. He loses his security clearance, so he can't really work on anything anymore. And he loses his professorship. He commits suicide. Once again, this is a horrible subject because it's dealing with history. He is forced to undergo hormone treatments by court order to fix his homosexuality, which caused him massive problems, and he ends up killing himself rather than deal with a society which does not want to deal with the fact that he is gay. And in the Mage continuity, his destruction as a person is helped along by the New World Order when he attempts to go rogue. And his treatment at the hands of Technocracy is the galvanizing event which makes the virtual adepts go, no, we're taking you down, and we're done. We are throwing in with the traditions. After this and what happened in World War II, we are done.
Which is interesting because we are not back at a Council of Nine until the 50s, when the virtual adepts formally join in, I think, 56. Is their petition formally accepted? But another awesome game is it is established in Mage continuity that two things happen at this time. One, a virus is discovered or invented to infect the virtual adepts because the New World Order and the Syndicate are sure that they are going to leave. So there is this cat and mouse game to figure out how much information they can collect when they defect to say, yeah, I know you fought against us, but look, we brought cookies. So the progenitors come up with the information virus. So they're accumulating information. And I always wanted to do kind of a last goodbye chronicle that was right before the virtual adepts depart. And kind of the other interesting thing that happens is there is this hypothesis that so dying while being shot results in his avatar being kind of pulled through the phone, as it were, and eventually being the reason we have a digital web. Some people say that there are certain corners of the digital web where if you can listen closely to it, you can still hear Alan Turing screaming. And I'm like, well then, how about that?
My personal theory about what the digital web is that the digital web is Mount Cough continued by other means.
Yeah, to me, it is the realm of communication.
Yeah.
It has gone through a couple of different ages. And the idea within Mage is not until the invention of the phone network and then computer networks on top of that, was there enough bandwidth to hold a person. When you're sending letters back and forth across the Silk Road, that is enough bandwidth that the idea of Mount Cough can form, as it were, that there is enough idea moving around to create this other space, but not until we have modern phone networks is there enough that there's something you can visit that's big enough that you can go into.
Just a complete aside, do you know what the first guided missile ever was actually a progenitor project? It's a missile which has a trained pigeon in it. There's a camera on the front of the missile, and the pigeon has been trained to peck at the silhouettes of ships in order to change the direction. That was the first guided missile design, and then they invented transistors, and they decided, let's not do this. So that's what happens when you take a progenitor and you put them in charge of an iteration X problem.
I hope they couched it in other terms, like we've come up with a biologically driven directional control entity, or even better, if they could have had it spell out pigeon or like bird as the acronym. We've talked about a bunch of sleeper things, and that takes us to, we have the war, we have the brief recovery, we have the foundations of a lot of things that we'll talk later. What's kind of the quick view of where these thoughts go kind of in the ensuing decades?
There's some bad stuff happening in other parts of the world at this period. It's impossible to cover it all. The Polynesian culture has been turned completely upside down by World War II and its aftermath. You have the island, it like affects it religiously with the development of the cargo cults, where suddenly industrialized modern materials suddenly become available to a society in large enough numbers to completely reconfigure it. And then those people who are running that airbase disappear and take everything with them, and they never care about those people ever again. Mm-hmm. And you have the displacement of Polynesians for nuclear tests by both the French and American governments, Bikini Island being the most infamous of those. China is interesting. Mao takes control of the country after fighting a civil war there since before World War II in 1949. If you're looking at this from an Akashic standpoint, a majority of the monasteries are much like the Buddhist monasteries in China at that time, are much like the monasteries that you would see in like pre-Protestant England, in the fact that they were living off of the rents of peasants who worked their land. And they are identified by the communist government as people who are living off of the fruits of the proletariat. There begins a program to kind of properly communist the Buddhism. So Buddhism under Mao, they found an official Buddhist Association of China, which all Buddhist clergy are required to be members of. There's a official Buddhist magazine, basically, that's basically marching orders for Buddhists in China to bring Buddhism in line with the Chinese communism. And the big emphasis of these teachings is to go back through history to various Buddhist thinkers from as far back as like the Tang Dynasty, and emphasize a less ethereal, transcendental form of Buddhism in favor of one that emphasizes worldly labor and work. Many temples and monasteries in your major cities are taken direct control of. And it's hard not to, while this is not explicitly covered in Mage, it's hard not to conceive of this as being a major blow to the Akashics, because there's definitely emphasis on removing the mysticism from Buddhist teaching in the most populous country in the world. This continues to this day, and they were tolerated and considered to be acceptable within the state until the Great Leap Forward in the late 60s, and then a whole bunch of terrible things happened that possibly, depending on who you listen to, has a death toll in the tens of millions. I believe 50 million dead is the count, the mostly accepted count of the Great Leap Forward, but also involved massive vandalism and destruction of Buddhist artifacts, a Mao's attempt to restructure China violently to a new era. You also see the annexation of Tibet during this era, and it's hard not to see that as a blow to the Akashics and their role in the world. But at the same time, you're seeing martial arts kind of arise as a thing in the West like they haven't before, and including as a meditative method.
And that's interesting because eventually even the technocrats lose control during the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward. So that is a period where for decades there is no strong magic presence in China at a national scale. There are a lot of players on the regional level. There's a lot of cloak and dagger stuff going on. And that's just an interesting period in that no faction in the Ascension War clearly has control over China.
Part of that, though, just from a meta standpoint, is that American authors have a hard time writing about China because no one gets out of bed in China unless 100 years of ancestors and 10,000 years of history tells them to. And when you have that level of, frankly, admirable historical awareness in your society, it's very hard to adequately encompass it if you're not a member of it. I have immense respect for China as a civilization. They're amazing, but as a Westerner, they're extremely hard to write, and it is out of respect for witnessing the absolute power and scope of their history. I look at that and say, there's no way as a Western writer I could properly encapsulate it. I think Chinese authors struggle to do so. You know,
and let's look at the second largest population on the face of the planet and see how White Wolf has done with that. India. Shit. 0 for 2.
Complete aside, I only like the Week of Nightmares plot because we get to see what Technocracy go time looks like. Like when Technocracy pulls Code Ragnarok, everything's on the table. What does that look like? Well, the opening maneuver is 4 giant orbital mirrors and weather control satellites. And then when that fails, hell, we're going to wrap a nuke in Primium and set it off and see what happens.
They did get an assist from the Kuijin.
8 like elder level Garu and all that.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
the kicker was the shielded Super B-2 bomber dropping the $10 billion Primium enhanced neutron bomb. And they're just like, do we know what this will do? Nope. Testing it would be ripping a hole in reality. That's why this is a Code Nat Ragnarok weapon.
And everything went fine until Xerxes Jones is like, well, no one is looking. Let's bluff something else in the well of the void. Oops. And last year was the 20th anniversary of the Week of Nightmares, July 1999 to 2019. I celebrated by toasting an antediluvian. I don't know what everyone in the audience did, but
and antediluvian.
Yep.
We're not sure of their name.
So any other thoughts before we get to the crunchy Meiji bits?
So it's an important thing, actually, specifically mentioned with the bata, but this applies to all the crafts.
Okay.
Is the bata, which are the voodoo Santeria-inspired craft. The Technocracy before the war pretty much considered them to be inconsequential and left them alone. And the bata kind of had this period where they could simply consider that not their fight. They were outsiders. Other crafts reported the same thing. They started feeling the pogrom started applying to them after the war. The New World Order decided that they have a plan for uniting everything into a global superstate, infiltrating both the Soviets and the Americans and uniting everything together and getting the worst of both worlds, that world will not have room for anyone except for the Technocracy. And the Ptah and other, like, this was noted in the books as being a point in which the crafts started being a target of the pogrom, which is a Technocracy campaign against reality deviants.
The theme to me that comes out of this is there's now no safe place to hide, whether it be the islands of the Pacific or the Tibetan Plateau. There's no place that you can escape to avoid the Ascension conflict.
But Mage is not about escaping. If you try to escape in Mage, it means that you're not being a good mage.
Yep.
That's the warning of the Masters. They fled to the Horizon realms, and nothing they did mattered anymore after that.
There's two ways that this period can come up. One, my characters are there or in something like there, whether it be an umbral realm or it be a part of the digital web that sticks to a particular place, or maybe someone's sanctum.
My favorite paradox realm, by the way, is simply the interior of a B-52 bomber during a run that repeats over and over again because somebody tried to do an entropy effect that didn't work.
So what do you think the key themes or stories that can happen in this window that we're talking about would be?
The key stories, I think, is you're talking about a world trying to answer the question of why. Like, the war is over, and it was not only a war like World War I. It is realizing the true vastness of the ability of humanity to do violence to itself. So one thing that's we're actually going to bring up in Mage Noir, the LARP we're running, is up until this point, from the Enlightenment, the rise of democracy, all these other populism, all this stuff, mages of all types had this argument for global ascension. The sleepers need to be empowered. We need to give our gifts unto them. World War II, the Holocaust, all the various atrocities of that era, raised for the first time, really, an argument from the elitists in Mage society, which say, the Technocracy did what we did not in the age of high magic. The Technocracy gave these people power. It gave them technology. What did they do with it? They vaporized 2 cities, and they organized the factory-managed death of 1 million people for no reason. You're going to look at me in the face after seeing the pictures from Dachau and Belkenwald and tell me the masses are to be trusted with power.
And at the same time, it is a point at which sleeper society has become so potent, to try and take those reins back would be seemingly impossible.
Yes, literally the President of the United States has more power than every master of forces in the world.
And are there any references or sources that you would recommend besides the ones that you've thrown out so far for people trying to grab that aesthetic?
The Manhattan Project, Reading on the Life of Oppenheimer.
Okay.
Is actually an excellent...
Like American Prometheus or something like that.
American Prometheus, thank you. That's the book I was looking for. If you want to dive into the Nazi associations with the occult, there are 2 books. There's Gods and Beasts by a guy named Dusty Sklar. So also covers Jung's 30s and early 40s dalliances with them. And Unholy Alliance by Peter Levenda are both excellent books covering that aspect of that ideology. There's a book called The Last Battle, which actually came out about 6 years ago, which is about the closing days of World War II in Europe, and when the German Weimar troops and American soldiers fought with French political prisoners to defend a castle against a SS force sent to basically massacre them. And it is a very interesting snapshot of that world. More fun kind of magey stuff. Obviously, going back through the noir movies is great. The Maltese Falcon and The Last Goodbye and all that sort of stuff. And there's just so much from Mage that obviously comes, like, you have The Shadow is a good one. The movie, Some of the comic books that have come out recently are actually really good. You have, the old Amazing Stories. You got Flash Gordon and all that kind of stuff, which, had such a profound influence on the Sons of Ether. Their realm in the Umbra is called the Gernsback Continuum, which is Gernsback was the illustrator for the Amazing Stories covers.
Yep.
And you got Doc Savage, the Rocketeer, is a great one from there. So like a lot of pulp stuff. Indiana Jones is pretty good. Cast a Deadly Spell, I know we've talked about before, is a excellent little known HBO movie. It really depends on where you want to. Like we said, it's touched everything. It's just such a tapestry that it's hard to say where to start. Like find something that interests you, and you could make an amazing Mage story about it, because you really had in the World War II and the aftermath, you had modern society finally looking at itself as a philosophical entity and saying, what does this mean?
Which to me leads into my last and favorite bit. When I think of a period, I try and think of the rotes or devices or wonders that would come out of that period that would kind of best symbolize it. Are there any gadgets or magics that you feel really draw from this era?
So I love doing gadgets because I always loved finding out what was new, what was sci-fi at that moment.
Mm-hmm.
Like we would never think of it being new. Like late 40s or so, the new thing is microfilm. The entire idea of you can put an entire library on a roll of film was new. And it was considered very sci-fi. So you could have in your like gadgets, like technocratic gadgets, you could have something the size of a bulky wristwatch with these knobs and plastic dials on it. But if you knew how to operate it right via the like hyper intelligent indexer, you can magnify, you can flip down a little magnifying plate and read like whatever reference material you need. And you basically have either a correspondence rote or a mind rote for knowing anything that is public knowledge, right? You have the entire Library of Congress on your wrist with this hyper effective indexer. It's always fun to look at technocratic things, which are an extrapolation of how someone in 1948 would see this as working. And that's what the Technocracy does. But then microcomputers show up, so it becomes completely like not erroneous that they would work that way.
Yeah, and the thing that leaps to mind to me, two of the interesting inventions from early in that decade are, in addition to Farnsworth color television, the aerosol spray can. And there, I can see a technocratic obsession with almost like the Burt Ward Batman of just this technocrat bedecked with this array of aerosolized charms with their Mage repellent and their Garu repellent, and any number of other things.
Spray on Kevlar.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that actually showed up at one point in an old sci-fi film, that spray on clothes. But, you know, it comes down to is like this is the age of super materials. Like it's fun, like petrochemical processing finally hits. You know, you could have super Kevlar or synthetic spider silk. The idea that petrochemicals can create all these miracle materials. And most importantly, by the way, in 1944, we finally get the invention of the thing we were waiting for. Obviously, the highest point of human civilization, silly putty. It was a research attempt to replace rubber because of Japan controlling the rubber plantations in Southeast Asia.
I assumed you were going to talk about one of the most destructive devices ever created that came out of the 40s. That is the Slinky. So yeah. We also get the aqua lung out of this period. So this is the first time that it is not just the Rokea and the Verbena water witches who are able to like emerge from the water
without a giant tube going into them, because you did have the diving suit.
Yes, yeah, you did have a proper diving bell and such, and the bathoscaph and a gym suit.
You had the Navy SEALs show up. The entire idea of special forces shows up during this time period.
Okay.
With the British Commandos and later the Rangers, and then that leads to the Navy SEALs and all this. The idea that you have an elite fighting force of that nature arises. The U.S. Army Rangers are actually modeled after the British Commandos, who in turn were modeled after the elite SS.
We also get the Frisbee. So if you want to have an antagonist that is doing low amounts of bashing damage at a distance, then I strongly recommend that.
You get the Vampire Scope, which was the first infrared sniper scope, which apparently was disastrously effective. And it was massive. It's comical looking now. But the entire idea of multi-spectrum viewing and infrared flashlights come in this. So the idea that you can strap something to your head and see in the dark is new. And also the idea that there's waves and emissions and energies which come off of people. So the idea that you can like sense people's life forces visually becomes a concept at that point. Orgon energy, I think, is the theory which arose from some of that.
Oh, interesting. And this is shortly after the invention of Kirlian photography, which is a mainstay of technocratic.
Gobbledygook.
Yeah, the ability to pick up on someone's aura by applying this intensely charged high voltage supply.
Well, the entire idea of using fields came from it. 1943 is supposedly the date of the Philadelphia experiment, which is the U.S. Army. If you read what is now considered almost certainly to be a hoax, these papers that state that they used electromagnetic fields to render this entire naval ship invisible, like to the eye and to all forms of communication. And there was this idea like it actually displaced it dimensionally and things like that. And according to other rumors, it like caused like crewmen to be like sealed into the plating of the deck, and stuff like that. And there's this entire legend about it. Never happened. Apparently, there was a ship that was bombarded with electromagnetic field, but they were just trying to degauss it to make it so magnetic torpedoes wouldn't work.
Oh, that makes sense. And we also get the dialysis machine. We get the first artificial organs. We could have this could be some of the first cases where we have centuries-old technocrats. We get the precursor to the mobile phone. We get these radio-powered cellular devices that are able to communicate across a network of radio towers.
The first idea of EM jamming was invented at this particular point in time.
Yep, the British have given us radar.
There's also the Ghost Army, which I'm sure the New World Order kind of had a charm for, which is the U.S. psychological and misdirection warfare, which were specialized in making people think entire armies existed, which didn't.
Inflatable tanks.
They would even drive around with speaker systems on battlefields to play sounds of tanks that did not exist. And they gave Patton his army, and his army consisted solely of radio traffic. Yeah. They were so good. They had one guy who could mimic the unique Morse code diagram, like fist is what they call it, the fingerprint. He could mimic 20 different people. And the German intelligence officers looked for that. They were too good.
And the interesting thing to me is that is also where we got the start of Bill Blass, noted fashion designer, and Ellsworth Kelly, one of the preeminent sculptors and painters and printmakers of the 20th century, were both members.
And if you went to the naval laboratories in California, you could sit down and have a conversation in uniform with Isaac Asimov, L. Ron Hubbard, Robert Heinlein, and several other of pretty much the progenitors of the entire post-40s science fiction wave. They were all serving in the naval laboratory in California at the time and had coffee together.
What do you think the magic world looked like? Like, what effects do you think were maybe debuted for the first time around this?
Before the advent of personal computers, of course, you have the idea of slide rules, right, for calculations. But often, this is what computers were actually used for initially. They would compose what are called firing tables, or calculation tables. These were used as like firing tables for artillery pieces, where you look up the column and the line, and you do it, and it tells you what degrees left and what degrees up to hit something that's traveling this far away at this speed. Mm-hmm. And there are these books of firing tables. And they did this for all sorts of things. If you wanted to find the square root of something, if you look in the back of an old math textbook, they actually have a pre-calculated table up to a certain decimal points. This is of every single square root, mm-hmm. or every single root of everything. Like this is a triple root, four root, whatever. And this was a common way of doing calculations. So you could have, let's say you have your little micro reader wristwatch that I described. You could have an effect where you have a pre-calculated sort of table of variables, and you adjust it, you twist your knobs, and so forth, and you plan, say, a gunfight according to these pre-calculated variables. And it is scientifically the optimal way of proceeding with this engagement based on these pre-calculations. And that is perfectly within the technocratic or Sons of Ether paradigm of that era. They would not conceive of a bulky wristwatch capable of making such complex calculations of thousands a minute, you could have an entropy effect.
Standard entropy 2, time 2, or forces 2, depending on what like incarnation that you would want to do. Just kind of anything that generally adds to a dice pool. And this could be your microfilm. This could be, I like the idea of there being precision micro slide rules that frontline technocrats get access to, that you expect someone to open their jacket and pull out a gun of some sort, but no, it's just a finely machined slide rule.
You have an nth dimensional slide rule. You turn it over, it's one calculation. You turn it over, it's another calculation.
And you turn it over again, you get a third set. And you're like,
yeah,
this is a 4-dimensional slide rule.
You could also use this to predict emotional reactions.
Okay.
Like you dial in various factors, and you say this person would behave this way. It's actually a mind rote.
Yeah, and one of the things you mentioned earlier was the whole idea of the subconscious, that we had gone from a Freudian model to a Jungian model. Do you think that would have made its way into Magic as well?
Well, considering it's written into the goddamn book, yeah. I mean, Dream is pretty much is the Jungian subconscious if you compare the two. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Mercado, you're showing your work there. We don't mind, but so Jungian psychology is based on the idea that the conscious mind is fighting the subconscious mind, and this is a problem, right? You have to find balance between the subconscious and the conscious mind. And the subconscious mind often has knowledge, either ancestral sort of like global knowledge that as a human, you know things with fangs are scary and you want to avoid them. And like the instinctual things like I don't feel safe here, mm-hmm. is your subconscious picking up on things which it knows because of its nature. And you could, through either Jungian therapy, hypnosis claimed to be able to do this, still does. You could willfully weaken the resistance of the conscious to subconscious input. And you would reach in and by balancing the conscious and subconscious and bring the subconscious to the fore, you can access knowledge that you did not know you could you knew, like hyper recall of not just information, but of I watched someone change a carburetor once, but I recall it in perfect detail, so I can do it myself. Or you can actually, according to some Jungian theories, you can access like a primordial feeling about a place, and all like the thousands of things you missed walking into this house and walking up the stairs that will tell you what is actually going on because your subconscious mind realized it, but you didn't.
So that sounds like a good practice, and even instruments, if you focus this through specially trained memory techniques or personality observation, that suddenly you can use like Mind 3 Correspondence 3 to pluck abilities out of someone else, or Time 2 to go back and remember how something was done, or just you talk about controlling the interaction between the conscious and the subconscious. This could be to remove distractions with Mind 1, Better Self to increase perception, or alternatively Life 3 to increase stamina, not necessarily by making yourself physically tougher, but your ability to ignore pain or the parts of your subconscious that are tugging at you that are say you need to slow down. This also seems like the first time where a technocrat might reasonably gain access to the technocratic equivalent of Dream, which is hypercram. Yes. The ability to just immerse yourself in information of some sort and to pull things out. You were also making mention of that the object in stops being myth and can be more contemporary figures. So instead of using the archetype of Hercules to make yourself stronger, it could be Charles Atlas or some drawing on the power of the zeitgeist, that these are now new mythic threads that are being formed, or hyper narratives in technocratic terms.
And Jung goes even further and says you need to put on the mask of, he has 12 archetypes. They have names like the hero and the ruler and stuff like that. And they can actually say these things give you an aura. They're a role you play. Mm-hmm. And they are archetypal roles. Your mind understands them. So you could chart social networks and influence social things by literally like mentally training yourself to take on a Jungian archetype of the ruler, of the caregiver. And you become inherently better at these things because your mind uses its existing machinery to leverage in a particular direction. And also, I mean, what you're looking at is really like the idea that science can explain and analyze human behavior. and that it can be systematized. It was a great era of systematizing. And I know we mentioned human factor optimization was almost exclusively an invention of the Americans. And it went into overdrive during World War II, and it continued on. And the idea that you can train people to act in hyper-efficient, standardized ways when they communicate, when they act, when they engage with them. So you can easily imagine a technocratic rote of human factor optimization that's completely linguistic, like the creation of human factor language, such as the use of the NATO standard phonetic alphabet. Not at that time, but like the use of radio alphabets, such as, Charlie Foxtrot, so on and so forth. That came out of human factor optimization. The term sitrep or amphor or stuff like that came from this use of hyper language, basically. And you could see that taken to another step by a technocrat, wherein they establish a set of lingo and language that probably would sound a lot like Newspeak from 1984, to be honest, where they could convey information with high precision and speed far quicker than any normal natural language would do so through the use of it. And it would almost be like speaking in tongues.
So that gives us the Mind 3 ability, or even the Seeming Forces ability, to convey a secret message. And again, it may not be quote-unquote true telepathy, but combined with the thing that you talked about before of being able to microanalyze body language, we now have something that is more or less like that. And I imagine through this human factor training, this is probably the first time where we get that idea of the precise movements of a Men in Black group that seems like they're psychically connected, but in actuality, they've done 2,000 hours of training on how to...
And they're constantly giving each other massive subtle signals to establish kind of a hyper-efficient gestalt, because they've established so many procedural ways of acting that is effective. A modern equivalent of this would be like a SWAT team with their various hand signals and going through and doing breaches and so forth. But imagine a group which can do that in any situation. There's an idea put forward in Foundation by Isaac Asimov of the language of the Foundation members is so advanced that a simple move of a finger and a single word can convey as much as a Shakespearean sonnet, because they have so much, they have such density of communication. But the way they convey this as a game is this is alien. This is unnatural. It's bereft of poetry. And it's kind of a chilling vision of a technocratic world where everything is so efficient there is no poetry.
And with that, thank you so much for joining us, Matthew. Is there anything else you'd like to kind of leave as a final comment, or alternatively, what are you working on these days?
Oh, it's hard to work on my chosen form of art in the age of COVID.
You're telling me this isn't peak LARP season?
Yeah, not exactly, no. So we are currently, Mage Noir has been rescheduled for next year. And also tickets have gone on sale for our rescheduled run of The Night in Question, which is our vampire game in 2021. It's going to be September 2021, knock on wood. And I'm also working on the Elysium Chronicles, which we talked about last time we talked to Gen Con. I'm also working on a couple of Kickstarter projects that I can't talk about yet, but one is Mage-ish, so okay. I might clue you into it at some point. Just remember, fear the fate of the ever.
I shall do so per your instruction.
Absolutely.
And when those get closer to release, if there's anything that you think our audience would be interested in, I'd love to have you back to talk. You've been listening to Mage the Podcast, which now counts for continuing education credit to maintain your certification as a World of Darkness storyteller. The show is made possible by executive producers, which include Anders, Andrew K., Andrew E., Brendan, Bryce Perry, Chris P., Chris Zach, Ira Grace, Jenna F., Justin, John Magnuson, Michael Parker, Richard Bat Brewster, and William. My executive producer shout-out for this episode is to Master Carpenter Jenna F. Advocate she is of the Arcanum, a real plot hook they have if you came to them. By crossing all game lines and occultly decked out to the nines, if they don't fight against night folk, can you blame you them? That one was a bit of a stretch. You can become an executive producer by clicking on Become a Supporter on the show notes or through the episode entries on our webpage. In addition to getting -2 to all charisma rolls with other World of Darkness enthusiasts, you get our special supporter-only show, So What You Playin', and preview of other Mage the Podcast projects. If you super liked this episode or super didn't, drop us a line at magethepodcast@gmail.com or at magethepodcast on Twitter. We have a hoppin' Discord community at discord.me/magethepodcast. You can subscribe to our show on Spotify, Anchor, iTunes, TuneIn, Google Play Podcasts, or other podcatchers of your choice. If you like us, please give us a review on the platform of your choosing or tell a friend about us. Also, go to magethepodcast.com for show notes and all of our previous shows. Now, go change reality. Bye.